Responsibility and consequence. Two words with immense depth and extreme importance. The definition of being responsible is something that hits quite a few notes, from our personal liabilities down to the political, professional, and even legal. An all-encompassing word used to describe the inherent need that we as people have to take ownership for not only ourselves, but our actions and those that we are accountable for. This is why it goes hand in hand with the word consequence. It's another word that holds quite a bit of meaning, but it also goes hand in hand with responsibility. As with our actions, the things that we're responsible for, well, they have consequences. Or rather, the things that happen as a result. This is a constant in media. These concepts are at play in just about every story that we read, movie we watch, and game that we play. Someone's actions will bring consequence, and responsibility is either thrust to a protagonist to solve the situation at hand, or forced upon them as they prevent the consequences of their or even somebody else's actions from affecting everyone around them. Though this is mostly something that we don't recognize on a conscious level at least. It's just an undercurrent, something that we inherently understand. So when a piece of media decides to make it the forefront and the center theme, it almost always comes in the form of something far more psychological and far more profound. Whether it's simply what side we choose in an ongoing conflict, or the decisions that we make in our own relationships and how they affect not only ourselves, but those around us. So it begs the question, how does this look when we fuse it with a psychological horror story muffled by the delusions of an unreliable narrator? Mouthwashing is probably the most intense and profound horror experience that I've played in many years. It lulls you into a sense of familiarity, marketing itself as just another out there and kind of wacky indie horror experience with some low poly graphics, Silent Hill style uncanny environments, and some awkward dialogue. Or the things that are staples in today's indie horror market. But like I said, that familiarity is something that it will use against you. So why don't we just start taking a look at the intro? We start off with some janky first-person gameplay, performing some incredibly basic actions before making our way out of the cockpit after we set a crash course for the entire ship. And as we walk through the hallway littered with cute but plastic corporate posters with basic information and a mascot for us to connect with, it only leads to the hallways and corridors that we're going down to shift into a more labyrinthian and maze-like experience, showing a blend of reality and illusion, and one that we really have yet to understand the source of. Is it supernatural, or is it a mental delusion? The deeper we make our way through, the more we see the environment change, and we get a few small little scares to ramp up the game's tension. Though it's nothing that you won't see anywhere else, whether it's Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion, or it's some Amnesia ripoff that you got off Steam. This goes on for a few minutes and is all just a build up to, well, the introduction of a mascot, a statue of a pony. Obviously we turn around to run away. And then the game gives us the oldest trick in the mascot horror book. But it's after this where the game truly begins and shows us what it's really like. We jump 2 months after the initial incident that crashed the ship, sitting at a table with our fellow crewmates. The conversation that we're in seems to already be one that's halfway through, leaving a large amount of ambiguity to just what's going on. Here we are introduced to our crew, who are revealed to be nothing but everyday schlubs, talking about what they should do regarding finding more supplies to keep them alive for as long as possible. In this case, it's breaking into the cargo bay and seeing if whatever they're hauling is useful. Mouthwashing uses a very similar setting as Alien. Our characters are on a cargo ship and are nothing more than blue-collar workers doing a routine job. They're not space marines or scientists or anything all that special. They're just space truckers hauling a load of goods from one place to another, working for a run-of-the-mill transport company. As our characters speak, they discuss how their cargo couldn't really be anything special, with the gruff old mechanic of the crew, Swansea, being the pessimist of the group, and our playable character, Jimmy, resolving that survival is survival and it's better to just take a look than to play by the rules of a corporation who clearly doesn't care much for its employees. This initial scene does a lot to unpack just what's going on without giving away too much. It shows us that we are everyday workers at the mercy of a shitty corporation, stuck on a damaged ship that's still habitable, but only has a sparse amount of resources to keep our small crew alive. The rest of the crew doesn't seem to show our player character Jimmy much respect, and even if he is now the acting captain. And the original captain is badly hurt and believes the person who caused the initial incident. What makes this introduction sequence so powerful is how within just the first 10 minutes, the game has already shown us its hand of deception. The introduction is ambiguous and really just sets the scene for how the disaster takes place, but with it seeming very real in the beginning, only to slowly morph into some paranormal fuckery as we progress through the corridors, PT style. It's the game's way of letting us know just how unstable the experience that we're going into is going to be, with us never really knowing when we're transitioning from reality to the supernatural. And by playing on a lot of the cliches of indie horror right from the get-go, only to really pull us into a boring and mundane situation right after, it plays with our expectations of the game, where we went from the fantastical experience of a generic horror game to a mundane walking sim where we have some tense and boring conversations like the one currently at hand. From just the first 10 minutes, the game has set up the expectation that it is going to trick you. It's going to make you think one thing, only to thrust you into another. This all becomes extremely apparent once the beginning discussion ends and we finally get to explore the ship. The main room is illuminated by an orange haze. It emanates from a large screen that acts as a fake window, something supposedly to help create a comforting environment, but now acting as a reminder that there is no outside world here. We're trapped in the endless void of space. The walls are also covered in plaster, encasing appliances and furniture, and even destroying much of them. The plaster acts as a reminder of just how thin the barrier of life and death really is in the situation that our characters have found themselves in. Much of this game's tension comes from the uncomfortable nature of its environment. This area looks like it should be almost cozy and honestly a little comfortable, though it's so plastic and fake that the corporate feel just makes it all suffocating and isolating. All of its posters and the handful of statues of the Pony Express mascot littering the ship, all of its rooms feeling semi-confident but each just a little too small and slightly under par for the needs of the crew. everything feels like it should be one thing, but is presented as another. And this all feeds into this anti-corporate sentiment that's been present since the start of the game when we saw those stupid little posters. And as we go on, it becomes increasingly palpable, especially when we hear our other characters talk, and it seems that none of them really have any hopes that the company is going to come look for them in time. Now, with that, we begin to get into the actual gameplay. And that can be best described as a point-and-click adventure game if it was adapted into a first-person perspective. Most of what Jimmy does aboard the ship is just go between crewmates and speak to them, discussing the situation and various issues that need to be resolved. We go around doing some basic tasks and the occasional environmental puzzle. And that's kind of the cycle that the game goes through during its first half. It's, like I said before, it's mundane and honestly kind of boring. It's the complete inverse of the intro, where we got a more interactable and fun, traditional horror experience in line with, again, most mascot horror games, where you run through corridors and try to avoid the impending jump scare or death that's coming your way. Where here it's just walking around, talking to people, and doing chores. But that's not to say that this game isn't good at creating tension. See, most of that tension here comes from the dialogue and the obvious signs of trauma and stress building within the crew. It's all about instability and the ambiguity of what's going to happen thanks to that tension and that ambiguity. And outside of some hallucinations that we'll experience later on, the more we get to know the characters and their dynamics, the more clear the dysfunction from this collection of people becomes, and the less secure and safe that we feel as we continue to try and navigate our way through this situation. So before we go any further, why don't we get to know our cast a little bit? The main playable character, Jimmy, is second in command, acting as co-pilot on the ship, and even taking the role as captain after the accident. Like Anya and Captain Curly, his psych evaluations reveal that he's struggling with some mental health issues, but isn't completely broken-minded. His personality appears to be very dry and matter-of-fact, showing subdued emotions and overall trying to be the level-headed one as he takes charge of the ship post-incident. While it seems that he should have a positive relationship with the previous Captain Curly, he always maintains a level of antagonism, which becomes far more palpable and direct after the incident. And to a lesser extent, this extends to the rest of the crew outside of Daisuke. A last-minute addition to the crew, Daisuke is the youngest person on the ship. He's meant to be an assistant intern under Swansea. He's poor at his job performance, though eager to please the captain and do well. His experience causes him to screw up basic tasks, and he's treated with relative disdain from Swansea and Jimmy alike. Despite this, Daisuke is actually the person who's most willing to go along with the plan and help out, and he's also the most optimistic throughout the entire game. But underneath his kind demeanor lies a deep-seated anxiety and guilt for his standing in life. Even his position on the ship only being given to him by his mother pulling some strings. A grumpy and fat old mechanic with a serious chip on his shoulder, Swansea is the most salt-of-the-earth member of the crew, and it shows in his attitude. He shows some respect for Captain Curly, but other than that, he tends to have a gruff and mean standing, and a no-bullshit attitude. His own stubbornness and laziness, however, ends up bringing issues to the rest of the crew, as he routinely prevents both progress due to his aforementioned stubbornness, and his attitude making an already horrible and tense situation all the more insufferable. He also seems to have a unique disdain for Jimmy, more so than the rest of the crew. and is very evasive on his true thoughts and feelings in any given situation, often weaponizing the tension in a conversation to attack others. A barely qualified nurse who struggles to do her job, Anya handles the medical needs of the crew. But as is hinted in a flashback, her qualifications are lacking as she had failed multiple times to enter medical school, and Pony Express, the company that they work for, was the only one who would take them into their health program. She deals with intense anxiety and is overall clumsy and a bit unreliable. She's obviously hiding some underlying issues, and given that these issues were very muted at the beginning of the expedition, but just before the crash they had become a bit more all-encompassing, so much so that it reached the point of her not being able to do her job, even something as simple as giving medication to a wounded man, it's clear that there's something beyond just the accident that's happened to her. The ship's beloved captain, Curly, is a bit of an elusive figure. All we really know about him, at least in the beginning, is that he's a well-liked leader to his crew, ranked high in the Pony Express company, and harbored a deep level of respect from those around him. He was also the closest with Jimmy, but as is apparent within the dialogue between the two, their relationship had soured at some point during the past. But Curly is relatively mysterious beyond these points. With only really a handful of revelations going forward, outside of the rest of the crew, post-accident, he's the only one who really sits things out. But I guess that's because he looks like this. Curly, to put it simply, is the conduit to which the game progresses. He's one of the most central figures in the entire game and plays into just about every single event. Yet, during the present sections, he's nothing more than a dead man biding his time. Burnt from head to toe with his limbs missing, Curly's only audible dialogue, if you could call it dialogue, is his labored and painful breathing and his wails of agony when he hasn't been given his medication. It's heavily implied that he was the one who crashed the ship, and as we learn a bit more about him, the more odd his entire existence becomes. Mouthwashing teaches us about him and really all the other crew members, mostly through the time shifts that we experience in the game. Mouthwashing uses a nonlinear structure to tell its story and play into the unreliable narrator aspect of its story, giving you more context to the characters' pasts and who they really are as the situation on the ship worsened. Occasionally the screen will abruptly freeze and glitch out before it returns with us in a different location and a rough timestamp to when all of this takes place. Most of these time shifts are splits between Curly and Jimmy, as in the present time we see things from Jimmy's perspective, and in the past we see them from Curly's. This is where a lot of the context or future events that we experience are fleshed out, and we're given answers to many of our questions, though often it poses just even more questions. Such as the psych evaluations, which reveal the nature of the delusions Curly is revealed to be experiencing, giving us new context to what we've already seen. These were not paranormal in nature, but rather a product of his mind as it breaks under the stress and God knows what else. And it's something that we see firsthand here. At a moment's notice, the entire world can change. In a moment, we can go from simply walking through the ship to walking through a shifting nightmare, ripping away our ability to know just what's actually happening. And when we re-enter reality, it also begs the question, how do we know this isn't all just a hallucination as well? Alright, let's take a bit of a step back. Because in order to really understand just what the fuck is going on in this game, you have to understand its presentation. Because above all else, it's really what makes the game what it is. And there's a reason why it has so much fan art and adoration behind it, and that's its unique take on its graphics, aesthetics, and art direction. As it all plays directly into showing off not only some of the game's influences, but also it nails down a lot of the building blocks that we'll need to understand it. The most notable and obvious thing to start with is the low poly aesthetic. The whole PS1 graphical style has been a big trend over the last few years, especially in the indie space, and, well, you can see it everywhere from Crow Country to Heartworm to Alyssa to Albino Lullaby. But where Mouthwashing really differentiates itself is in the actual style of low poly that it chooses. It avoids the whole PS1 and N64 approaches entirely, and instead opts to emulate the Dreamcast. An overlooked console in just about every way, at least outside of the Sonic Adventure games, the Dreamcast is a very odd yet interesting beast. It was much brighter and clearer graphically than any of the other consoles of its generation. Being that weird in-between of the 5th and 6th gen, it maintained the toy-like quality of the era, but it was also not as high fidelity as something like a PS2 or OG Xbox. Its graphics were much more smooth and easy on the eyes, which was a stark contrast within the jagged pixelation of the PlayStation and the little toys of the N64. And this graphical aesthetic would lend itself to becoming very unique in how it appeared in horror games. Illbleed is a very strange and obtuse little game, but it's a Dreamcast horror classic because there's nothing else quite like it, and a large part of that is, well, the graphics. They're smooth and almost clay-like, with their shapes defined yet still very obtuse and generic, and the characters and environments are all just, again, they're kind of in this uncanny valley era between PS1 and PS2, contrasting with that saturated but still muted color style, and everything just has a very dreamlike and ethereal vibe, and it creates a distinctly subtle yet uncanny visage. Mouthwashing takes this and uses it for all it's worth, playing into the overall aesthetic, but also using it to really ground its graphics in the surreal and dreamlike nature of its dialogue, story, and nightmare sequences. On a game level, nothing feels real, and constantly jumping around the timeline and going in and out of what is obviously reality and what's obviously a hallucination, and then being trapped in the uncertainty of the in-between, creates a dissonance in our ability to understand just what is and isn't real, and when we're caught in between. On a meta level, by having its graphics and dialogue in this style, mixed with the constant graphical glitching and jumping, it plays with our minds by never allowing us to truly feel grounded. We always feel stuck in a weird haze. And this palpable aesthetic is where the game gives us a lot of clear ideas as to where it's pulling its tricks from. The game probably has far more influences than just what I'm going to bring up, but the specific ones that come to mind when I played it are Jacob's Ladder, Event Horizon, Silent Hill 2, and Neon Genesis Evangelion. To start with the easiest example, Event Horizon seems to be a big influence on how Mouthwashing uses its ship layout. While Event Horizon is much more over the top in this case, it still does the whole this is a spaceship and sometimes we're hallucinating, or maybe it's the paranormal and everything is transforming into a bit of a hellscape. Because, well, spoiler alert, it's actually just hell. Mouthwashing uses the same approach, just more subdued and borderline psychedelic, when we get stuck in a hallucination. Now, Jacob's Ladder, on the other hand, is much more direct in terms of how it influences the game's story and presentation. Jacob's Ladder is one of the most integral films of the early 90s, as it set a much different standard for how psychological horror could be done. The story of Jacob Singer is a bit of a complicated one, but it's also one that's similar to Mouthwashing and how it shifts from reality to hallucination. In the film, we see Jacob constantly shifting between his past in Vietnam, his present in New York, and his experiences of hallucinations, seeing demons and a hellish version of the world. But only sometimes is his shift palpable to the viewer. Most times it's a subtle shift that flies right over your head before someone or something shows us just how far from the normal world Jacob really is. This is how Mouthwashing plays out as well. The deeper into the experience, the more we shift from the past to the present to the future, and from what we think is reality on the ship to a hellish otherworld, the same one that Curly saw, and it causes us to wonder, is this just a delusion, or is there something deeper at play here? Especially when we start to take into the recurring theme of responsibility and the underlying theme of consequence. And this is what it shares with Neon Genesis. And while Evangelion's influence is a bit more distinct in the game's presentation, with the way it does its cards and text, some of the more choppy editing and even its color scheme, it's another series with themes of mental delusion and instability, as well as responsibility being thrust onto someone who just isn't the best fit for it. Alright, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself, because outside of a hallucination, intense intro, and some tense dialogue and chores, we haven't seen a whole lot of these themes just yet. So let's get back on track and talk about just what moment shifts things into the more psychological. As we saw in the beginning, our first scene post-accident is a conversation about getting the access codes to the ship's storage, and see what they're hauling. Jimmy takes it upon himself to get the scanner to reveal the code and open up the hull. Anything to try and get some hope in a situation that's been nothing but tense, frustrating, and dysfunctional. But just as the doors open up, everything stops. The screen glitches, fading to the past, 7 days before the crash. We're behind the eyes of Curly now, and as he speaks with Anya about something, Curly laments his sleepless nights as he struggles to pay attention. He's passed his psych evaluations, though Anya is still concerned about his mental well-being, and she's also dreading having to perform the next psych eval on Jimmy, revealing that he treats her poorly, as well as revealing that Jimbo might be a brony. Well, we could easily take this scene as a simple bit of exposition to pad out the plot and give us some time to humanize Curly. What it really does is reveal that tensions were already mounting before the accident. And the more time we see Curly speak with his crew, and the more we come to understand the representation of him Jimmy gives post-accident, the more they contrast with each other. And the same goes for the rest of the crew as well. Anya is still a bit anxious here, and she's still reserved, but not nearly what she is post-crash. Daisuke is still the same lovable, optimistic goof, though he's a lot more genuine here and less out of a need to maintain sanity. Even Swansea is still a smart-ass grumpy dick, though he's much more restrained, and again, we actually see him give a little bit of respect to the captain. And that's not even mentioning how much of a contrast the ship itself is. Not just because it isn't destroyed, but simple details like the lighting being more bright, the fake windows showing a beautiful blue sky rather than the ominous orange one, the board game that Anya and Daisuke play with each other, the stupid fucking clown magazine. Seeing the ship and crew like this, is just like a mirror, but on the other side we see just how bad things are in the present. But the big elephant in the room here is Jimmy, who has the biggest contrast out of everything. While in the present he is a decently competent, relatively cold-demeanored person who is trying his best to save his crew, here he's just kind of a hot-headed and bitter asshole. On our way to the cockpit to do his psych eval, however, we do experience something a bit peculiar. As Curly descends the staircase, it becomes darker and more abyssal, seemingly endless. If we turn back, we see just how far down we've really walked. We see ourselves stuck in the middle. And the deeper we go, the more the tension builds, until we reach the end of the hall and we fall down into an empty void, now surrounded by red water and the space and stars above. As we continue to venture, we hear ominous yells, like an animal hunting us, until finally, this happens. How fast this went from subtle and creeping to overwhelming and terrifying was like a blink. Curly's mind is broken, distressed, and afraid, seeing a warning and ladders implying a destroyed ship, like he could envision just what was going to happen. And just as it reaches its peak, the sequence ends when we're swallowed by the sun. Now in a white void that's seemingly endless outside a single door, we find ourselves marching through it. Where we finally have our conversation with Jimmy. While still giving Curly his dues, he shows a clear disdain and frustration about him, even rejecting Curly's plight when he tries to confide in him. But it's also here where we get a real hint at Jimmy's mental state, his psych tests showing signs of him also not being too well. It's hard to figure out if this is all real or just another part of Curly's delusion. That is until we get a message from corporate, and once again, we're thrust back to the present. Jimmy has made his way down to the cargo bay, but during that time, everything has gone intensely dark. There's text that we can only vaguely make out covering the screen. It's almost pitch black, but there is one light, a faint one not too far off. And as we make our way to the ominous luminance, we see it's a TV. One that wasn't previously here and is very oddly placed at that. And when we interact with it, we're greeted with some odd shows giving us some scattered information. It both plays into the facade of corporations who care for their employees only to work them to death, but the TV also shows us some scenes hinting at something else. A scene of space where a wormhole or Big Bang style event happens, and it takes the shape and color of an eye. And as we continue to click through the channels, we get more of these cryptic looks at what is just random footage. Though knowing how this is all playing out, it all probably means something. But that is until we finally see this. Endless bottles of a low-priced brand of mouthwash. That is all the ship is hauling. A cheap, disposable hygiene product, and as you could imagine, the crew reacts about as positively to as you would expect. This plays into the corporate nightmare of the entire experience, the game focusing on the awful ways that corporations tend to treat their underpaid and abused employees, knowing that they can fuck them around and the employee is powerless to do anything about it, all while cutting corners to minimize costs, making the work environments all the more unbearable. A fact that becomes inescapable as it's all for nothing. Their peril and horrific situation, one from which they are more than likely going to die from, is all just to transport a product as unimportant and as minuscule as a bottle of mouthwash. All of the suffering in the world, and not for some important research, or life-saving medication, or even food for the hungry. Just bottles of generic mouthwash. From here, things start to really go off the rails. Swansea throwing out years of sobriety to drink the mouthwash like it's whiskey, and Anya falling into an even deeper pit of despair. And Daisuke, as usual, just kind of being lost in the situation, trying to figure out how he can navigate it. The music in this scene just makes it all so poignant and clear. In this moment, all hope is gone. From here, the game both slows down and ramps up. We consistently switch between the past and present, and from Jimmy and Curly's perspectives. The first shift that happens is one of the most important. As I said before, it seemed like tensions were already reaching a high level before the incident took place, and that's all thanks to a message we got from corporate. During Curly's birthday celebration, right before the cake is served, the customary captain speech is demanded by the crew, Jimmy in particular. And a nervous Curly, not knowing what to say, as he feels the immense guilt of bearing some dreadful news, just after confiding about his own disheartenment of his position, he lets the crew know that this would be their final voyage on the Pony Express before they let them go. Needless to say, this doesn't really go over well with everyone, with Swansea in Swansea fashion ragging on the situation while Daisuke and Anya sit in a mixture of peril and anxiousness. But what really comes to play here is Jimmy's reaction. He's a lot less upset about the company, and rather than that, he points all of his anger and frustration directly at Curly, taunting him with his own plight that the previous scene showed, and going as far as accusing him of really just wanting to be rid of the crew who he sees as dirt. An accusation that Curly can't really find the words to dispute, before cutting the cake with absolutely no enthusiasm, almost struggling to just get the knife through to the bottom. After this, we're back to the present in the eyes of Jimmy, waking up to the wailing of Curly. But before we can give him what he needs, we have to make sure he hasn't already taken his medicine. So, Jimmy makes his way down to the cockpit. We enter to see Anya and Swansea talking. Swansea still holding that axe in his hands. And the conversation is muffled. Something is deeply wrong here. But we don't really know what. Once we get the confirmation to give Curly his oxy, we make our way back to the infirmary, hearing his wails all the way through. And as we stand over him, Jimmy's cold streak breaks once again, opting to fill the air with the venom of his words. And before giving Curly his medication, asking what she would do before it fades to black and we hear, this audio is absolutely harrowing. And by not showing us the footage, it makes it almost worse. Knowing Jimmy is beating a near dead man to a pulp. And once we fade back in, that familiar string of strolling text takes the screen with words that can barely be made out. We're now face to face with Curly again, but at the dining table with yet another cake. The error screen fills our massive window. The conversation here is actually sort of cordial, but also it's impossible. Curly's sitting at a table having cake with us, cryptically talking about how we will all try to escape, but in the end all we can do is make a life for ourselves that we don't want to run from. But we just beat Curly unconscious after giving him his oxy. And even then, he couldn't walk or move himself. While Jimmy has had some issues with his mental state, nothing has quite been like this. But I guess that's the theme here. Since the beginning of the game, we've watched as Jimmy has attempted to negatively paint Curly and stay steadfast in his own ruse of being responsible, dependable, and caring, only to time and time again be faced with contradictions to that very idea, both in terms of his personality and his mental state. And this current hallucination or dream that he's in solidifies that Jimmy is suffering similar delusions to Curly. And as we look for a knife to cut the cake, we see how broken Jimmy's mind is actually becoming, as the only thing we find is an axe. And as we go back to cut the cake, things only get worse as eyes begin to appear to follow us. And as we make it back to the dining room table, the cake is missing. And Curly has taken its place. Four months have passed since the crash, and now we see just how bad things have gotten. As we walk out of the cargo bay, we see Daisuke lying drunk on the floor, a bottle of mouthwash in hand, resolving to himself to drink until he dies, rather than wait for the inevitable. It's here where he confides in Jimmy his own plight. As an undecided young adult, unsure of what he wanted to do with his life and the guilt that he feels for being on the ship. He was never even supposed to be someone here, but was put on at the request of his mother, trying to help him get in the right direction. And at this point, Daisuke's not the only one who's feeling this way. As we make it back to the dining table, we find Anya, who is also staring deep in thought at a bottle, though she doesn't want to drink it. Running out of medicine and ways to keep herself busy, she is losing what little hope she has. Jimmy is honestly surprisingly less aggressive towards her in this scene. He even takes her up on the idea of trying to break down some of the foam just to get some more medicine from a blocked locker, even if it risks destroying the ship. But as nice of a change as this moment presents, it really only demonstrates just how little hope Anya and the rest of the group have. So much so that they're willing to risk it all for what realistically is just a week or two more's worth of medicine that's only really going to be given to Curly. And when we go to ask Swansea for the axe to try and get it, it once again becomes apparent. Still stubborn as always, he drunkenly dances in front of the screen. His aggression this time coming across far more playful, until the conversation eventually turns into an argument, throwing the idea of responsibility in our face before smashing the screen with an axe, the cracks themselves resembling an eye. This point is very important, as these last few strings of conversations and the previous delusion that Jimmy had just demonstrates how broken each member of the crew really is by this point. And after we break the foam and get the medicine, it gets even more intense, as Anya asks you to give Curly his pill because it makes her nauseous. And Jimmy's friendly facade from just a few minutes ago completely disappears and is replaced with frustration and rage as he rants and rants about how he has to do everything, only to be interrupted by a split-second splash screen asking us to take responsibility. And like a switch was flipped, Jimmy returns to being cold, sending Anya to care for Daisuke as he goes to give Curly his oxy, this time sympathizing with him rather than abusing him. And Jimmy's words leave Curly in tears, only for the screen to fade and this to happen. Alright, now before we go forward, let's discuss the idea of structure. As any high school sophomore can tell you, most stories play out in either a 3 or 4 act structure. A 3-act structure is the most common, and is your typical setup, confrontation, resolution. So, the majority of fiction, especially in terms of action, drama, romance, etc. For example, we can take a look at the film Evil Dead. We have the setup of Mia and friends going up to a secluded cabin for a drug detox / rehabilitation, that being the setup. Then we have the confrontation, which is the Deadites attacking the human characters after being released during the setup. And for the resolution, we have Mia overcoming the Deadites and slaughtering the abomination. Now, this is extremely oversimplified, but it does give you the basic idea of the 3 acts. Now, on the other hand, we have our 4-act structure, which is more common in stories that play out with more complex themes or with situations where direct confrontation isn't really viable. A lot more horror films tend to play out this way, as the 4 acts are just the same as the 3, but Act 2 is now split in half. You have the setup, rising obstacles, then the confrontation, then the resolution. A great example of this would be the anime Parasite. We have our setup of a teen being infected by a body-snatching parasite, only to survive but have to coexist with it. The rising obstacles being learning how to coexist, as well as survive as a human-parasite hybrid, as well as ways of dealing with the other parasites living amongst them. The confrontation here is fighting back against the parasites that are putting humanity into peril and threatening to destroy them. And the resolution being defeating the final parasite and ridding the world of its threat. As you can see, these structures are very similar and simple to understand. One just has a little bit more to flesh out characters or the situations at hand, or just plain build tension. Mouthwashing very easily fits into the 4-act structure, though where it gets a bit more complicated is how it uses the nonlinear timeline, similar to what can be seen in Pulp Fiction, to tell its story. But Mouthwashing also has yet another trick up its sleeve that sets it apart from everything else. And that is the elusive 2-act structure. It uses this on top of the 4-act structure. The 2-act structure is typically used in very simplistic media, be it some TV shows and books for toddlers. But what's interesting is that in many cases, this 2-act structure can be melded into larger structures when it's applied to not only the story, but rather to pacing, tone, and theme. Okay, sorry. This is probably getting a little confusing, so let me try and give you a bit of an example. The Korean vampire movie Thirst is a perfect examination of how you use the 2-act structure along with the 4-act. It works within the traditional 4 acts, but in terms of its pacing, the 2-act is applied. For the first half of the film, Thirst plays out like a classic vampire story. It's slow, brooding, subdued, and only occasionally goes off the walls in order to keep you entertained. It allows for the themes of the story and the situations at hand to build and hold quite a bit of weight, but it also allows for the movie to trick you a bit. After the 40-minute mark or so, you're probably pretty comfortable with a film, with how it's being paced, and with the overall expectations you have for what the rest of the movie is going to be like. But that's the thing. This is just the setup half of the 2-act structure. Just instead of the story, it's set up in the tone, theme, and pacing. The 4-act is still being used for the actual story. So when that part 2 of the 2-act structure hits, it happens with the confrontation. And after this, the script of the movie is flipped entirely. Halfway through Thirst, a specific event will happen, one that's gory, horrifying, and fast-paced. And from here, the film completely shifts. No longer is it a slow, brooding film playing on classic structure, but now in its second half, it's a fast-paced, intense, modern-style horror film with shock, gore, and speed. While this might still be a little convoluted and maybe a little confusing, you at least have a better idea of how this works. And this is exactly what Mouthwashing uses to play out its own story. We can even label these 2 acts like this. Act 1, weaving a web of misdirection, and Act 2, unraveling the truth. The entire first half of the game has been a massive web of misdirection, lies, and manipulative storytelling. The game has been drip-feeding us context and allowing us to make assumptions long before the reveals. weaponizing our expectations against us. And throughout the runtime so far, we've seen a solid portrayal of Jimmy and the other crew members through and through. Yet, as the occasional outburst by Jimmy or the oddly placed references within a conversation that we lack context to understand, as well as flashbacks from Curly's perspective, each offering contradicting information, context, and personalities to the characters, it leaves a trail of breadcrumbs, but it never gives us enough to know just what is going on and just what's true. Like I said, Act 1 is about weaving a web of misdirection, and Act 2, which we are about to enter, is an unraveling of that web. And the murderous confrontation with Swansea is the axe that breaks the glass. It's after this that we enter the point of no return. All the lies, all the misdirection, it all begins to crumble, as Consequence is finally reaching Jimmy, and the truth of the game's events, characters, and overall story begin to unravel into the horrifying mess of the truth. We once again loop back to before the conflict. Daisuke comes to tell us that shit has really hit the fan, and Anya has trapped herself with Curly, refusing to open the door to the medical bay. She leaves us with some strong words, a string of prose that would make anybody worry, before ending it off by taunting Jimmy with the words he had become so famous for: "I'll take care of it." In a panic, Jimmy and Daisuke confront Swansea, who, as you could guess, is uncooperative as always, still sitting guard, not letting anybody enter the utility room. But it's as we plead to him that the broken vent is the only thing that we have that can get us back in the medical bay to save Anya and Curly, another abrupt cut happens. And we see Daisuke writhing in pain, covered in blood. Swansea and Jimmy are both yelling, "We need to get disinfectant on Daisuke's wounds." But our bottle is missing, and Jimmy utters some words under his breath about using it. Something happened during that cut that we still don't know. Another direct crack in a facade that's been built up. But one after another, a situation keeps befalling Jimmy, each one tearing more and more of that web away. And in Cargo, we finally get a little bit of the truth. At least the truth on just who is hallucinating. This time, after we discover a grave, we follow a trail of blood. And just like during the psych evaluations, things escalate quickly. Except with Jimmy, it seems like something actually wants to chase him. Our peril in this situation manifests as a bloodthirsty beast invisible outside of the captain's black light. A beast that can only be seen by those who hold the burden of responsibility. And as we make it to the silly little pony mascot, now a horrid reminder of our failure as a captain, we come face to face with the cold hard reality that nothing can stop our sins from catching up to us. In a haze of panic, Jimmy convinces Daisuke the only way to get into the utility room is to spike a cocktail with disinfectant in order to get Swansea to pass out. A plan Daisuke is obviously uncomfortable with, but our dear old Captain Jimmy, in all his genuine concern and desire to save his crew, manipulates him into going along with. And once they take down Swansea, they make their way into utility, just to see that he too is a little bit of a liar. The room is relatively untouched by the foam outside of its walls, even maintaining a single cryostasis pod, one that's still operational. Swansea lied, and he guarded this room. His true intentions possibly to wait till everyone dies so he can take a refuge in the pod, though we never know. Either way, it was an act of selfishness. And with that, Jimmy uses this as yet another way to guilt trip and manipulate Daisuke, as he observes just how deadly a trip through the vent would be, with hot electrified wires drooping from the hole. And it goes about as wrong as you would expect. But before we see just what's happened, we're back behind Curly's eyes. One day before it all went wrong. We're searching for a gun for some reason. An odd thing to want to find when there's no present danger just yet. In our search, we find Anya, having a panic attack and distraught. And this is that final moment before the web is truly unraveled. Anya was sexually assaulted, and Jimmy was the monster who did it. Her entire character is recontextualized in this moment. She wasn't some mousy fuck-up like the beginning plays her out to be. Rather, she was a much deeper and more complex person, trapped in an awful situation. And Jimmy didn't just mistreat her because he was uncaring. The disgusting truth is that Jimmy was the predator, and Anya was his prey. Her pregnancy, the product of his crime. Silent Hill 2 is a game that's been analyzed to the point of absurdity. No stone has been left unturned, no moment not shifted through, but with that, it still is a game that stands the test of time. An experience that even when you know just how it all plays out, you still want to engage with it. And a large part of that comes from its portrayal of characters, from Eddie, Maria, to Angela, and even the big man himself, James Sunderland. Each of these characters are complex, deeply so, and while they may appear to be simple and easy to understand upon introduction, they each have their own very distinct and very complicated backstories that contextualize the game's narrative as well as the actions that they take, all of which being revealed the deeper we dig into the mystery of the town. Mouthwashing obviously has done something similar with its own small cast, and it takes a lot from Silent Hill 2, from its hazy and dreamlike atmosphere to its sudden shifts between reality and the other world. And while people may take any low-poly horror game and compare it to Silent Hill, the big difference here is that Mouthwashing is truly inspired by Silent Hill 2. It's not just trying to emulate its graphics or copy some story beats here and there, or even try to copycat its gameplay. Rather, Mouthwashing is taking the concepts and ideas used to make the characters and writing of Silent Hill 2, and it's applying them to its own dark horror tale. And this is evident no clearer than the case of Jimmy and his similarities to James. James Sunderland is a deeply flawed man, one who we meet during a very, very low point. As he enters the town to desperately find his wife, even though he admits that she passed away years ago, what follows is a psychological terror trip through a town full of mystery, horror, and weirdly personal attacks and references to James. I'm not going to go through much of the story here, as we would be here all day, and you already know it. The reveal that James is a murderer. He's the one who killed his wife. And the weight of that guilt is what's led him to the peril that he is in currently.
I was weak. That's why I needed you. Needed someone to punish me for my sins.
Jimmy is no different. A monster whose actions and inability to take responsibility for them has led to the current predicament. And now his mind has created punishment, and one that he can't escape. In a vain attempt to save Daisuke, we pour the mouthwash onto him, only for Swansea to reveal his own deck of cards. The gruff, mean, old blue-collar finally takes his mask off and shows sympathy and compassion to the young man in front of him. He reveals the fondness and the care that he actually held for him. And when he's finished, pouring what little bit of his heart he had to share, he grants him mercy. Not the kind that he deserved, but the kind that he needed in that moment. Swansea then taunts Jimmy as he loses his grasp on restraint. And looks for the captain's gun. And when we open the medical bay, we see just what kind of tragedy befalled Anya. Bloodied and surrounded by bottles of pills. Her and the child she was bearing, dead. And as Jimmy picks up the gun, Curly begins to laugh. And Swansea attacks. We finally see the truth in Curly's eyes as we come across Anya. She confides that she took the situation into her own hands to confront Jimmy. As much as this was something she deserved to do, it would prove fatal, as no one but Curly understood just how unstable Jimmy would be. And after a fruitless confrontation, it all becomes clear. Jimmy caused all of this. His inability to just take responsibility, his selfish delusions, his disgusting and malicious outlook. It all took hold, knowing that if the truth left the ship, his life, his legacy, his reputation, his career, it was all over. So why not just take everyone with him? It's also here where everything that we've experienced becomes recontextualized. The hallucinations and delusions of Curly were never actually his own. At least, not the first and most important one. The beginning of the game wasn't him setting the ship up for disaster, but actually Jimmy, in a last-ditch effort to save his own crumbling life by taking himself and the crew with him in one of the most selfish acts of denial possible. This reveal, along with the previous allusion to his mental illness early on into the game when the psych tests were discussed, completely recontextualizes the first half of the game. This was never a story about corporate greed or bad working conditions. This was never a story of a captain going crazy and in a fit of insanity trying to take himself and his crew out. This was never even a supernatural story of carrying some Lovecraftian object hidden beneath the mouthwash, driving the entire crew to the depths of insanity. At the end of the day, this is a story about a delusional and pathetic little man struggling amongst the pressures of his life and diving headfirst into his selfish and delusional nature to run away from any consequence to his actions, and the pressure from his guilt, regret, and stress, all culminating in him losing his mind and falling deep into the pits of his own mental abyss. But as we experience the second half of the game, we have to come to terms with each of our sins, the wrongs that we did, and no matter how much we or Jimmy try to run, there's nothing we can do to escape. As reality begins to set in, it also fades away. Jimmy's mind fully breaks, and now all he sees is the nightmare of his mistakes and crimes. In a vain attempt to bring himself back to the moment before everything broke down, the last time there was a semblance of normalcy, Jimmy brings Curly to the dining room, and he sets up a birthday party. The gang's all here. Eager for some cake. And with that, Jimmy picks up the knife, ready to cut. As disturbing and grotesque as the scene is, it's easy to miss just what makes it so powerful outside of its shock value. To break it down, the original birthday scene isn't where things went wrong initially, as that would have been around the time that Jimmy assaulted Anya. But to somebody who's deluded and in denial of their actions, the time in their head when something would have went wrong would have been when the catalyst happened to bring change in the air. And for Jimmy, that would have been Curly's birthday, where rather than just enjoying the party, he pressured Curly into his speech. And when the struggling captain gave out the news in a fever of guilt, Jimmy took that opportunity to rage against him, an attempt to paint Curly in a negative light to the rest of the crew, taking an already unsettling situation and attempting to up it to 11. Something in his head that might have been the moment that pushed Anya's despair and burden over the edge. And what better way to signify sacrifice rather than consumption? But this is just the tip of the iceberg, as the rest of the game forces us to see Jimmy through his journey to the precipice. And as that oh so familiar glitchy cut happens once again, we make our way into the vents. our journey begins. What follows is a psychedelic fever dream of pure, unbridled horror. First, we are forced to stare into the light, or be faced with Daisuke. Punishment for the unfair death that we brought him. Constant reminders of that 14-letter word, the one that we have ran from this entire time. And the deeper we go, the more blatant it gets. As we walk into a graveyard, we see a framed picture of our dear friend Daisuke. Jimmy is no longer able to deny what his actions caused, as he comes face to face with the consequence. And this right here is the theme for the rest of the game. Jimmy's shattered mind forcing him to run through his actions and face judgment, see the consequences of what he's done, and have the comforting lies he told ripped away. And for the third time, we're forced to kill Swansea. Though this time, he's the one hunting us. In a maze of gravestones. And once we finally take him down, we're face to face with him tied to a chair. Swansea's story is a dark mirror. He reveals his past of being a selfish drunk. Someone with a plight not too different from Jimmy's. Someone who is selfish, trapped in vice and bitterness. But unlike him, he did what he had to and changed his life. Through discipline, and especially responsibility. Even if he hated it, he knew what he had to do. The very thing that Jimmy has failed to do his entire life. But still trapped in denial, refusing to see the ire of his ways, Jimmy once again proclaims that he will fix everything. Only to... With each denial of responsibility, Jimmy is taken further into the nightmare, with constant reminders of how wrong he really is. And the person who suffered for him, a sacrifice to his selfishness. But he can't escape the eyes of judgment. No amount of denial can take the burden off his shoulders. His demented mental state at this point is forcing him to make a choice. Continue to sink, or just take responsibility. But like the pathetic coward that he is, Jimmy continues to choose delusion. Once again trying to go back to the time in his mind before it all went wrong. Only to further torture a man who's taken the brunt of the punishment for him. By feeding Curly his own leg, he's attempting to reverse the sacrifice he made. But no matter what he does, how many valves he twists, or how many times he feeds Curly himself, nothing works. Despite everything, Jimmy still thinks Curly wants to be the fall guy. He still envisions him as that sacrificial lamb, even though he claims he wants to fix it. This scene just shows how deeply Jimmy wants to escape responsibility and find a way of making it seem like both Curly and himself are in the right. Claiming all this was just an accident, and even when owning up to what he's done, he still finds a way to deny it all. And just like that, we fall back even deeper, still not learning our lesson. This is one of the most horrific sections of the entire game. As Jimmy must face the consequences of not only what he did to Anya, but the pregnancy he caused. The fetus, a twisted monster, an embodiment of all his sin. But this time, there's no escape. And no matter how far we run, the constant reminders are here to stay. It's at this point that everything finally sets in. Jimmy realizes that he can't escape his consequences, and he finally attempts to take responsibility. He brings Curly to the cryopod and sets him to freeze indefinitely. In his head, fixing the situation, and the final step righting his wrongs. And that right being a gun to his temple, ending everything and finally closing the book. Look, that was a lot, and I'm sure you have some questions. So let's just try to cut to the core of it all. At its heart, mouthwashing is about responsibility. Not just in the way that it beats it into you throughout its second half, but forcing you to come face to face with the consequences and truth behind Jimmy's actions. It's about the entire idea of responsibility and how when it's neglected, abused, or given to the wrong person, it will cause severe problems. On every level, the lack of responsibility is at play. We spent the entire video focusing on Jimmy, so I won't really repeat myself with him here. So let's discuss the other characters. Daisuke wasn't ready to take on responsibility and start his life, even though the time had come for him to do so. And by being a bit of a pushover, he refused to set his own path for himself, and ended up on the ship he had no reason to be on. Swansea, despite taking a lot of responsibility for himself and really pulling his life together for the betterment of himself and others, still lacked the drive and humanity needed to maintain positive relationships, resulting in the borderline abusive way that he treated Daisuke and his laziness that prevented him from fixing the busted vent that would end up being such a detrimental piece of the puzzle in the game's events. Now, we also have Curly, who is a bit more complicated because he was very responsible, but he still lacked it in the places that mattered most. And that place was uncomfortable confrontation, leading him to not handling the Jimmy situation properly and creating the perfect storm for the game's events to take place. And even the company itself, Pony Express, is deeply at fault for what's happened. Their lack of responsibility in pursuit to try to cut as many costs are what brought everything together. The cheap living environments, the lack of supplies, allowing a ship in need of maintenance to just fly out, putting the burden of firing their employees on the shoulders of their captains, or even just the fact that there's not even a cell or hole on the ship, just in case a situation like this happened. It's all just a complete neglect of responsibility, but no other character is as much of a victim to it as Anya. She was just someone who wanted to be a nurse, and despite her failures to make it into medical school, here came Pony Express, ready to ignore her inability to do the job, ready to give her the most basic and probably shitty training, and throw her aboard a ship she never should have been on to begin with. Anya goes to Curly for help, only for his lapse in responsibility to result in not only nothing happening for her justice, but when she does finally try to take responsibility into her own hands, it serves as the catalyst of the entire game's events. It all just comes together to really paint Anya as this just deeply tragic character in every way. Everyone and everything around her failing her, not able to be responsible for her as they should. And when she finally tries to take care of herself and be that responsible person, it's what brings the end of her life. While to a degree, just about everyone in Mouthwashing is some form of tragic character, not you, Curly is one that really sits as the most poignant. He was just a captain, someone trying his best to lead his crew, despite the issues he had been dealing with and his feelings of discontentment. He always tried to keep things civil and find common ground to solve issues, only for the pressures of Pony Express's decisions to fire the crew and the Jimmy situation to push him over the edge. But Curly's biggest flaw is what led to his downfall, and that was his misunderstanding of how to deal with these sorts of situations, especially with Anya. While he was trying to be pragmatic by keeping things civil on the ship, since it would be months before they would be at home and actually able to take legal action or seek justice against Jimmy, his denial of responsibility and his inability to just face the conflict led to Jimmy getting away with it, only for Anya to seek her own recourse and, well, you saw what happened. Curly's simple indecision and his weak-willed plight are the reason that everything happened. On the surface, Curly is a relatively innocent man, the wrong guy in the wrong place. But on a much deeper level, he's someone who failed to take responsibility for his crew. He failed to bring the justice that needed to happen. And due to that, he faced hell. He may not be as innocent as some would think, but he still is a sympathetic and tragic character. And ironically enough, the only character who will be stuck living with the consequences of Jimmy's actions and his lack thereof. Now, before we end things off, I do have one thing to show you. This is my wall of shame. The people with no financial responsibilities funding this ship straight into the sun. And you know what? I can't thank them enough. Their support keeps the lights on, and I couldn't be more grateful for it. In fact, I wouldn't have been able to make this monster of a video. So hey, if you like what you see, or you're just a narcissist who wants his name put up on some random YouTuber's page, then hey, links are in the description. But with that, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.